I've noticed I've let a fly into the house, a blue. So people listening might hear bzzz every now and then. Hopefully Basil will be quiet, my cat, but otherwise we're going to have buzzing, and then we're going to have you and I, Cathy, talking.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wanted to kind of begin this with full disclosure that, you know, Cathy and I know each other and are friends. And I was talking to Cathy just about I was wanting to do some research on the effect of the cost of living crisis on people.
Mm-hmm.
And I was talking to you last night, and I was sort of saying, do you know anybody? And we kind of ended up talking just a bit about people's perceptions of poverty, didn't we?
Yeah.
And of poor people, you know. And you just said, well, let me tell you about my life.
Yeah. I think the first time when I actually felt like a poor person was shortly after I gave birth to my first child, as a single mother, and the first perception I had of being poor was the fact that I was really isolated. I was in a rural setting. You had to have a car to get anywhere, which I did have at the time. But the stigma of being a single mother affected me.
And when was this?
This was 1984.
In Norfolk.
In Norfolk.
But you were saying stigma. How did that... Did people actually say things to you, or...?
Several things happened, and it's not necessarily all about being poor. It was a lot about my character as well. I'd become vegetarian, and I'd stopped wearing makeup, and a lot of people thought because of that I had low self-esteem, and that I'd let myself go was one of the things, whereas actually it was a philosophical choice to do both those things. And then as a single mother as well, I think I was pushing my luck as far as conformity in being... my personality is incapable of conforming, which I'm truly grateful for. But it did cause me and my children a lot of trouble, because I was poor, but I didn't spend my money the way that a lot of poor people did, which was to keep up appearances. And keeping up appearances was a very... I was born into that life. My parents... it was almost your overriding motive, I think, when I was a child, that you had to look at least as good, preferably better than everybody else around you, keeping up with the Joneses, I think it was called at the time. So I was born into that, and I think I had... my father had an anarchistic kind of character, and I think I've inherited that. And again, I'm truly grateful. So it was very... I was judged because I didn't do all the things that you should do to make yourself not look poor. So I didn't care that my clothes were scruffy. I cared that my children had a decent meal. So while other people, so as they got older, so other people who were in probably the same, for a start off, I was born in an area where most people were actually quite well to do. They were two-couple families. The guy and quite often the woman more and more had little jobs. You know, the guy had a full-time job and the woman would usually have a little part-time job. So I didn't have any of those things. And when my children started being... So I had 3 children. At one point I had 3 children under the age of 5, and that was when I was at rock bottom financially.
And can I just ask, I mean, obviously, you know, not to go into many personal details, but I guess had you been in a relationship and it's fallen apart? Or
Yes. It wasn't in that much of a relationship. I got pregnant, mentioned it to the guy. We weren't in a relationship, to be fair to him. So his attitude was really like, what do you expect me to do about it? There was no such thing. There was child maintenance, but I didn't actually... I don't believe in extorting money out of anybody, and the idea of legally going after the father to help with maintenance didn't sit right with me, so I didn't name him as the father of my child for that reason. And the same with the next 2 children. I had different father, and with the result that they never gave me any money, so I didn't get any support, financial support. My parents, bless them, I'd shocked them rigid by having 3 children out of wedlock, and not that they said that particularly, but it was I'd made my own bed, and so I got very little support from family and their fathers, and it kind of, because of that, it all... what do you call it? It kind of builds up a momentum of its own. So not only was I not looking like I should, I didn't get any support from my children. So I think that it's almost the same as now that I'm getting old. It's almost that you're almost stuck with other people's perception of you. So because people thought that I had low self-esteem, I actually got low self-esteem because nobody wanted to know me particularly. Nobody wanted to know. For a little while there, I looked the roughest. And you know, I wasn't the pretty girl that you wanted to take out on a date. I wasn't anything that anybody wanted particularly. I've got these 3 children and we all looked pretty scruffy. It is like that. So the stigma is that you actually live up to people's perception of you, and people's perception of me wasn't good.
And so you were in this, was it a village, I guess, or?
So I lived in a village in Norfolk until my oldest, and I had been living there for 15, 20 years, I think. Then I moved to Somerset to be with my younger children's father, so I had 2 children with him. And I lived with him for about 5 or 6 years. He, a hippie generation guy, nice enough guy, but it wasn't suitable to me in character, and I was almost blowing my lid, like couldn't really cope with domestic life. in the way that I was kind of supposed to. So I came back to Norfolk with my children on my own. Lived in a caravan for a little while.
And how old were your kids at that point?
So my youngest was still a baby, and the other two were I think my oldest was about, she'd already been going to school. I think she was about 7 when we came back to Norfolk. So I lived in a caravan on no electric.
No electric?
No, we had gas, so we had gas lighting and gas cooker. That was okay. No water, so I had to pick up water. So I was running a car, and it was things like that. So I was running a car that was already a lot scruffier than any of the other mum's cars, and then the back window broke, and I was taking my daughter to school in this like really bad looking car, and these things just layer on top of layer on top of layer of how you're perceived.
And so, like you said, it started then because people saw you that way. You started thinking less of yourself.
Yes, or being confrontational, being angry. You know, it's not fair that they're looking at me that way, although I'd done it to myself in lots of ways. You know, maybe if I'd have put a bit of makeup on, it wouldn't have impacted me if I looked the part a little bit more, but I didn't. And by that time I didn't have money to do that anyway. I couldn't have afforded the makeup anyway. So it all became I was in a muddle. But whereas I saw other kids being fed like baked beans on toast 3 nights a week, my kids were fed properly every day, proper meal, and that was, if it went no further than that, that's what we had.
And how did you do that? Like, so could you work, or
no,
looking
not
after
for a
3
little
kids?
While. Yeah. So I started work as soon as my youngest could go to nursery for a couple of hours every day. Then I got a cleaning job, so I was still claiming benefits. So I was illegally doing a cleaning job, and that's how it went on for the next 10 or 15 years. That was my life. I was claiming benefits, but I was also working this little job, that little job, and slowly, you know, I got a good reputation, and slowly more little jobs, till the time when my youngest was about 7, and then I would say I was still on benefits and working, and having to be back at school. Couldn't afford a car a lot of the time, so it was hitchhiking around Norfolk
to do your cleaning jobs.
To do cleaning jobs, and so sometimes you'd have 2 hours in one village, and then you'd have to hitch to the next village to do another 2-hour cleaning job. So it was all a bit mad, and then I'd have to hitch home again to be in time for the school bus to arrive. So by this time I was living in another village. And then by the time they were all at school, still on benefits, but still working, but I could afford to take them out sometimes. I couldn't afford anything, you know. I remember one of the kids started dance classes and loved it, but we could only ever take anything so far, because if you get good, then you have to have all the kit. And there's no way. There's no way I could have afforded any of that sort of thing. I'd do things like, and by that time I'd got good relationships with a few other single mothers, and that was where our strength lay.
So you started getting a network.
We started looking after each other, which before, when they were young, I had that to an extent as well when I was living in Somerset. When I came back to Norfolk, I felt that isolation again, and that's the thing as well. When you're in that position, I mean, you can't go out and meet people. You've got 3 children. So any networks that you haven't got already, and I've noticed this a lot, we were kind of half by necessity and half by my fault, my responsibility. We were quite nomadic, and you never build up these networks. You've never befriended the mechanic and had him round for tea, so he's going to give you a good rate. There's that. So that all has to be built up every time. Relationships with people that not because you want them to do you favours, but these things happen organically.
And they do help.
And they help a lot.
In the end,
they make all the difference. That's what made all the difference to me, was I started getting work with friends. So the whole thing became a bit more jolly. But for those years, between 1984 and I would say 1994, like that first 10 years, that was when I really felt like a victim, poverty. And I felt like I'd brought it all on myself, which I had. You know, another woman wouldn't have had 3 kids without a stable relationship, but I've never had a stable relationship, so I don't know how to do a stable relationship. You know, so it just didn't work for me. My parents were in a completely stable relationship, and I didn't like what I saw in a stable relationship, so I was kind of, there was a bit of me that couldn't maintain that kind of relationship.
Didn't feel safe in it or right in it or whatever.
Didn't feel right. It didn't feel safe. Didn't feel like me. Didn't feel like I was doing the best thing for my children. And that's the thing. Is that I know that I looked like very flighty and very irresponsible. But actually, when I was in those relationships, I continuously, on a daily basis, felt really guilty because it felt wrong. Every time my partner would say something that I really didn't want for my children, he didn't know it, but he taught my children to fear, where I would have taught them courage. There was these things. He was the sort of guy that would. I remember my oldest child, when she was about 2, throwing a complete tantrum because he wouldn't let her climb in the car on her own.
Oh, because he was like, it's not safe. He was worried about the danger.
Yes. So he would take away their, to me, their sovereignty
and their confidence
and everything. And I was feeling guilty, and I also felt guilty for the whole feminist, because I was stuck at home in the kitchen all the time, because that's the only thing. So I felt bad about everything that I did all the time.